So our next module will be discussing succession. Nothing stays the same in an ecosystem. It is constantly changing.
So what is succession?
It is the observed process of change in the species structure of an ecological community over time.
So basically succession is the changes in the living things in an ecosystem over time?
Exactly. We mainly have two different types of succession. We have primary succession and secondary succession.
Okay, let's discuss primary succession first. Primary means first, right?
Yes, primary succession is the process that begins in an area that is entirely uninhabited by living things. It's an area that's uninhabited, which means no organisms are there. Bare rock, such as hardened lava from a volcanic eruption, is an example of this.
So what are the first organisms that are able to grow here called?
The first organisms that are able to grow on this uninhabited area are called a pioneer species.
So the pioneer species are growing on bare rock?
That's correct. An example of a primary pioneer species is the growth of lichens, mosses, and fungi. Secondary primary species include wildflowers, weeds, and grasses, and it takes hundreds of years to reach maturity, which is considered the climax community.
What is a climax community?
A climax community is when the ecosystem is at its best. We consider a climax communities to be the ideal ecosystem for the area, but it's because it's considered stable.
So the level of biodiversity would be high, therefore the sustainability of that ecosystem would be high too?
Right.
In this slide you'll see primary succession where no life existed before. On this side you'll see bare rock, and as time travels, mosses and lichens grow on the rock and then eventually form soil when they die. Soil develops and grasses and smaller plants grow, and then the soil can then support shrubs and eventually trees. Here's another diagram showing primary succession. You'll see on the left side bare rock, and the first living organisms on the rock are going to be lichens, and then small plants, grasses. Eventually you can see here how the roots get deeper and deeper, and then you reach over here where you have the climax community where you have a stable environment. I've included two pictures that show lichens growing on rock, and when these die their remains produce soil so the first grasses can grow.
Correct. The other type of succession is called secondary succession. Secondary succession occurs in areas that were previously inhabited but experienced a natural disaster. Natural disasters can be a forest fire, a tornado, tsunami, or even a flood. Human activities such as clear-cutting of forests for timber can also cause a secondary succession.
How long does secondary succession take? I don't think it would take as long as primary succession since there was already an ecosystem there.
Secondary succession takes much less time than primary succession does. It only takes up to 100 years to return to a mature state, which we mentioned earlier as being a climax community.
So when we talk about the differences between primary and secondary succession, is the main difference that primary takes a lot longer?
That's because secondary succession begins with the soil already there, and it can take up to 500 years to make the soil that is 1 inch deep.
So what happens towards the end of the...
This graphic shows fire. You will see that after a few years some plants start to grow. There's already soil there, and you have grasses and perennials and eventually shrubs, and then tall trees end up being looking like it was before. This is a much quicker process than primary succession. Primary succession can take hundreds of thousands of years. Secondary succession can be 150 to 200 years, and then you see the original climax community. There's another diagram of secondary succession. The key here is that there is already soil. It doesn't have to form soil, so progress of grasses to shrubs to trees is much quicker than with primary succession.
Types of succession.
Well, as we get further into the stages of succession, the biodiversity increases. and high biodiversity tends to add to the stability of an ecosystem.
What else can affect the amount of resources available?
The climate of the area will affect availability of the resources. For example, a lot of rain in a tropical area versus no rain in a desert. These can be considered limiting factors. Thanks.